There is a sound the Galactic Council chamber makes when something goes wrong. Not an alarm. Not a voice. Just nothing. The ambient hum of 17 translation matrices cutting out at once. The soft clicks of datapads lowering onto tables. The specific silence that only happens when beings who have watched stars collapse and civilizations dissolve over 300,000 years of collective memory look at a screen and, collectively, forget how to breathe. I have worked this post for 11 cycles. I have filed 943 incident reports. I have watched the Vethkai delegation walk out. I have watched the Morosai ambassador be physically restrained from the podium. I have watched a vote on the extinction of an entire insect species go to recount 4 times because nobody could agree on what sentience threshold meant. I have never heard that silence. Not until the humans. The feat had come in flagged routine, a border skirmish on a mid-tier contested corridor, species classification 7C, which in council shorthand means we're watching but not intervening. I'd queued it into my secondary monitor the way I queue everything, with the specific combination of low expectations and desperate hope that maybe, this once, something interesting would happen before my shift ended. What happened was not what the designation 7C border skirmish is supposed to contain. What happened was actually. I need to start from before that. From before the chamber went quiet. From before Senior Delegate Orvai knocked over his ceremonial water vessel and didn't notice. Because the thing about humanity, the thing nobody in that room had understood until the feed cut to that valley, is that humans don't fight the way anything fights. They don't fight the way predators fight. They don't fight the way prey animals that evolved upward fight. They fight the way something fights when it is decided, at a level below language, below strategy, below anything you could put in a threat assessment or a species profile or a 7C incident flag, when it has decided that this specific thing is not allowed to happen. Not cannot. Is not allowed. There is a difference. I understand that now. I didn't, sitting at my desk with my 3rd cup of Vethel liquid that smells like burning rubber and tastes worse, pulling up what I thought was going to be a 40-minute clip I'd summarize in 2 sentences. I understand it now. Here is what happened in that valley. Here is what happened in the council chamber. Here is why the translation matrices cut out. And here is why, 6 days later, I'm still filing supplemental reports and nobody from classification has called me back. My name is Incident Analyst Saravet Doan, and I need to note for the record that I am writing this under protest. Not protest of the assignment. Protest of the framing. Senior Archivist Vaughn asked me to produce a comprehensive emotional and strategic account of the Corridor 7 incident for the Council's long-term behavioral xenology archive. What she means is, write it like a story, not like a report, because the 7 reports you've already filed aren't making the Council understand why this matters. Fine. I'll write it like a story. I'll start with the coffee. The coffee, the Vethel liquid, technically, which bears approximately the same relationship to actual coffee that a boot heel bears to a foot, was my 3rd of the shift. My console had been running a passive monitor on Corridor 7 since the morning flag. The flag itself was unremarkable. 2 contested corridor incidents in the same standard week was above average, but the Makath sovereignty had been conducting what they called territorial affirmation exercises in that sector for the better part of a cycle, which in less diplomatic language means they'd been pushing their border markers 6 kilometers west every time they thought nobody was watching and daring anyone to say something about it. Nobody had said anything about it, because the Makath sovereignty controls 3 of the 7 primary hyperspace relay nodes in the outer arm and the Council does not have a death wish. Corridor 7, the disputed section, sits between Makath space and what the humans call the Pharaoh Corridor, a supply line they established 18 months ago for their 3 outer settlements. Those settlements have a combined population of approximately 400,000. The corridor is how they receive medical resupply, food stock rotation, and the particular brand of fermented grain beverage that a non-trivial fraction of human cultural ritual apparently requires. When I pulled up the morning flag, I noted Makath patrol vessels, for units, conducting an affirmation sweep 12 kilometers inside the nominal corridor boundary. I noted 1 human cargo freighter, ICS designation Brannicus Promise, civilian registry, currently mid-transit with a full supply load. I noted no human military assets within response range. I wrote probable seizure scenario. Recommends standard diplomatic notation. I sent the notation. I got my third cup of methyl liquid. I came back. The feed had moved. The Brannica's promise had not, as I expected, cut engines and prepared for boarding. It had, in fact, accelerated. I checked the readout twice. Then, I checked the vessel classification. Civilian cargo freighter, mass approximately 14,000 standard units, engines rated for standard transit speeds, 0 weapons systems on manifest. The Makath patrol had matched acceleration. Standard pursuit formation, 2 vessels flanking, 2 at distance as net closure. This is what Makath patrol vessels do. They're good at it. They have done it 47 times in this corridor over the past 3 cycles, and, in 47 out of 47 cases, the vessel being pursued stopped. Cut engines. Accepted boarding. Paid the tariff the Makath call a transit fee and, the Council's legal subdivision calls extortion with plausible deniability. The Brannica's promise did not stop. I flagged the feed to secondary. I started a new incident report. I annotated, civilian vessel apparently attempting evasion of Makath patrol. Likely outcome, failed evasion, escalated boarding, possible seizure. Recommend then, the Brannica's promise did something that made me stop typing. It decelerated. Not to stop. Not to surrender. It decelerated in a specific vector downward relative to the corridor's navigational plane, toward the debris field that edges Corridor 7's southern boundary. The debris field is the remnant of a small moon that broke up approximately 11,000 years ago. It is categorized as a navigational hazard. Ships do not go into it. The mass and density of the debris makes standard navigation impossible without taking hull damage. The Brannica's promise went into it. The lead Makath patrol vessel, call it Makath 1, did not follow. It adjusted to a holding position at the debris field's edge. This was, from a tactical standpoint, correct. Waiting out the freighter is logical. The freighter has to come out eventually. Cargo freighters do not have the supplies for extended evasion. The Makath patrol could simply wait. I made a note, civilian vessel has entered debris field. Either crew is unaware of navigational risk or is attempting to use field as cover. Expecting emergence within 2 to 4 hours, at which point something came out of the debris field. It was not the Brannica's promise. I want to be precise about timing, because timing is the thing the Council keeps asking me about, and timing is the thing I keep having to explain. The Brannica's promise entered the debris field at 14:22 station time. What emerged at 14:31 9 minutes later was not the Brannica's promise. It was a much smaller vessel. I did not have it in the registry initially. I ran identification twice. On the second pass, it came back as a utility craft, the kind of short-range maintenance shuttle that cargo freighters carry for hull inspection and minor external repair work. Mass approximately 300 standard units. No weapons. Life support capacity, 4 beings. It was moving very fast. It was moving, specifically, directly toward Makath 1. I remember putting my methyl liquid down. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just looked down at some point and, my hand was empty and, the cup was on the desk and, I was watching the feed with both eyes, which I generally try not to do because it strains the secondary lenses something terrible. The shuttle was transmitting. I caught the edge of the frequency, not a standard distress signal, not a communication request. The humans on that shuttle were talking to the Makath patrol vessel in Makath standard. My translation matrix caught most of it. What it caught was, engine failure, life support compromised, we have injured aboard, requesting emergency boarding protocol under the Corridor Transit Accords, Article 14, Medical Emergency Provision, Article 14. I actually laughed. It's a reflex I laugh at surprising things, which is either an endearing quirk or a significant professional liability, depending on who you ask. Article 14 of the Corridor Transit Accords is a clause that was inserted by the Hurani delegation 40 years ago and, which has been invoked exactly once, in a case involving a Hurani diplomatic shuttle and a minor fuel leak that was arguably not life-threatening. It requires any patrol vessel to render emergency assistance to any disabled craft, regardless of affiliation, regardless of active interdiction. The Makath were legally required to allow the shuttle to dock. They did. Under protest, their communications were coming through on open channel and the tone was the particular flat anger of beings who know they're being handled and can't do anything about it. But they did. The shuttle docked with Makath 1 at 1433. At 1441, Makath 1's patrol formation broke. Not gradually. Not a vector adjustment. The vessel, a 2,000-unit patrol cruiser, lurched out of formation and began moving in an uncontrolled spiral that took it directly into the path of one of its flanking vessels. The flanking vessel fired positioning thrusters to avoid collision. The two remaining patrol vessels moved to assist. The formation, which had been holding the corridor perimeter neatly, was now four ships trying to avoid hitting each other. The Brannick as promised came out of the debris field at 1443. It was moving at full transit speed, directly on course for the Faro Corridor access point. The Makath patrol vessels were not in a position to pursue. By the time they had re-established formation, the freighter had made the access point and was gone. At 1447, the shuttle, still docked with Makath 1, transmitted a polite message to the patrol commander stating that the medical emergency had been resolved, the injured crew member was stable, and they would be departing. They thanked the Makath crew for their assistance. They detached. They flew back into the debris field. I sat with that for a moment. Then, I wrote in my incident report, civilian crew appears to have staged a medical emergency to force a boarding protocol and disrupt patrol formation during freighter transit. Sophistication of operation significantly above expected civilian capability. Recommend reclassification. I sent the report. I got a fourth cup of Vethel liquid. I did not yet understand that this was the prologue. 3 days later, the second flag came in from Corridor 7. This one was not routine. The Makath sovereignty, presumably irritated about the Brannick as promise incident in the way that powerful entities are when they've been outmaneuvered by someone they didn't think was paying attention, had escalated. They'd moved 8 patrol vessels into the corridor. Not a sweep. A blockade. They had positioned the vessels at the 2 primary entry points to the Faro Corridor access lane and they had transmitted a formal notification to the human settlements. The corridor was under temporary closure pending navigational safety review. Navigational safety review. I filed a note, the debris field has been present for 11,000 years. The Makath sovereignty has been navigating this corridor for 60. There is no navigational safety concern that has not existed for the entirety of that period. This is retaliation for the transit incident. Nobody from legal responded. I pulled up the human settlement communications, they're on open relay, not encrypted, which either indicates a significant operational security gap or indicates that the humans do not particularly care who hears them, and I listened. The first thing I noted, they didn't panic. Not visibly. The settlement administrator's recorded message to the outer stations was, I'm transcribing from my log, hey, heads up, the Makath have done the thing. Supplies are going to be delayed. We're working on it. Working on it. 400,000 people on supply restriction and, the official communication is we're working on it. I flagged the feed to primary. I moved my Vethel liquid to the left side of the desk, which is what I do when I'm actually paying attention. I started a new log. For 4 standard days, nothing visible happened. The blockade held. The human settlements received no resupply. The Council received 2 diplomatic notes from the Makath sovereignty, both framed as navigational safety concerns, both requiring no immediate response. The Council sent a standard acknowledgement. I wrote 3 reports noting that the blockade was functionally an embargo, that it was time to the medical supply rotation cycle for the outer settlements, and that if it held for more than 12 days, the outer stations would begin experiencing pharmaceutical shortfalls. Nobody from medical classification called me back either. On day 5, a human appeared on the Makath sovereignty's secondary communications channel. Not a distress call. Not a diplomatic note. The human, and I later identified her as Operative Yasha Merrill, Faro Corridor Defense Initiative, which is a title that sounds bureaucratic and is not, had somehow access to Makath internal channel and was using it to place what the Makath later described as a trade inquiry. She wanted to purchase 800 units of Makath standard atmospheric seal compound. The Makath duty officer, I have the transcript, it's in Appendix C, was apparently so confused by this that he actually responded. He told her that the Makath sovereignty did not sell seal compound to non-aligned species. She said that was unfortunate. She had a fairly significant quantity of refined Corridor 7 debris field silicate that she'd been hoping to trade. Makath standard atmospheric seal compound uses refined silicate as a primary component. The Makath sovereignty imports refined silicate from 3 suppliers, all of whom are in the outer arm, all of whom are accessible only through, among other routes, Corridor 7. The duty officer asked her how much refined silicate. She told him. I don't have the exact figure in my notes, but, based on the subsequent silence on the channel, it was enough. The duty officer said he would need to consult with a superior. She said she'd wait. She waited. On their internal channel. For 2 hours. Talking, occasionally, to someone else off-feed. I could catch fragments, and what I caught was something about whether someone named Becker had eaten anything today, and that the blue ones were fine, the green ones were the problem, whatever that meant. The superior came on the channel. He was not warm. He asked where she had obtained refined Corridor 7 silicate. She said the debris field. He said, that debris field is a navigational hazard. She said, yeah, we noticed. Another silence. He asked what she wanted. She said, the corridor. He said the corridor was under navigational safety review. She said, funny thing, I've been out here a while, corridor seems fine to me. The negotiation took another 6 hours. I listened to the whole thing. I have the transcript filed. What she traded, and this is the part one keep returning to, the part that I underlined in my log 3 times, was not just the silicate. She had, in those 4 silent days, mapped the debris field. She had identified 6 navigable paths through it, paths the Makath patrol vessels had no charts for. She offered the charts. In exchange for the corridor and a signed Makath commitment to the transit accords. The Makath sovereignty representative asked her how she'd mapped the debris field in 4 days. She said, carefully. He said, that field has been listed as unnavigable for 11,000 years. She said, sure, but nobody who needed to navigate it was in a hurry before. The Makath sovereignty lifted the blockade on day 6. They did not announce it as a concession. They announced it as the conclusion of their navigational safety review. The council received a note saying the corridor had been cleared. I filed an incident report. I noted that the human operative had, without any military engagement, resolved a blockade affecting 400,000 people by, first, mapping an 11,000-year-old debris field in 4 days, second, identifying the economic leverage point of the blocking party, third, constructing a trade offer that gave the Makath something they wanted while simultaneously signaling that the thing they'd used as leverage, corridor control, was less complete than they'd believed, and, fourth, doing all of this while apparently managing someone named Becker's dietary habits. I recommended reclassification of human Corridor 7 activity from 7C to at minimum 5A. I sent the report. I got my 5th cup of Vethel liquid that day. I was still, at this point, looking at the secondary monitor. I moved it to primary at the end of the shift, because of what came in on the overnight flag. The overnight flag was not a trade negotiation. The overnight flag was a Makath Sovereignty Priority 1 distress signal from their Corridor 7 relay station, a small installation, mostly automated, that sits at the corridor's midpoint and maintains the navigational beacon network. Specifically, the relay station was under attack. I pulled the feed. I blinked. I pulled it again. The attack was being conducted by 3 humans. 3. Against a Makath relay station staffed by 22 Makath soldiers and equipped with standard-issue perimeter defense systems. I want to note, for the record, the size differential. The Makath are, I'll use the standard xenological description, large. They average 2.5 meters standing, with a body plan built around significant upper body mass and reinforced joint structure. They evolved on a high-gravity world. They are not, in any taxonomic sense, fragile. The 22 Makath soldiers at that relay station had, between them, approximately 3 times the body mass of all 3 humans combined. The feed came from the station's own security system. Which meant I was watching through the Makath cameras. Which meant I was watching the Makath lose. Not overwhelmed. Not overpowered. Outplayed. The first human, I later identified him as Sergeant Operative Declan Birch, and I will be returning to Sergeant Operative Birch at significant length in the following sections, had gotten inside the perimeter by the simple method of having been inside the perimeter for approximately 4 hours before the alarm triggered. The security logs show him in the station's maintenance access corridor, a crawl space, functionally, sized for the automated repair drones, for 4 hours and 11 minutes before he moved. 4 hours in a crawl space. I noted this. I noted it again. I made a small mark in my log. 4 hours. Not moving. Not signaling. Waiting. When he moved to the station's primary communications array and attached a device to the relay transmitter. The device, our technical analysis later determined, was broadcasting a false navigational beacon signal identical to the real beacon, with one small change to the timing pulse that would cause any ship following it to arrive at the corridor access point approximately 40 kilometers off the designated entry vector. Not enough to cause a collision. Enough to confuse any patrol vessel trying to use the beacon for precise positioning. He was done in 11 minutes. He was back in the crawl space in 12. The alarm triggered 20 minutes later, not because of anything Birch had done, but because the other 2 humans had walked in through the front. I mean that literally. They'd walked to the main entrance, in civilian clothes, with a cargo manifest claiming they were delivering equipment ordered by the station commander. The station commander had not ordered any equipment. When the soldier at the entrance pointed this out, the first human, a woman, tall, with an expression my translation matrix flagged as polite but immovable, said there must have been some error in the requisition system. It happened all the time. She had the order code right here. She did not, in fact, have an order code. She had a data pad showing what appeared to be an order code, which was actually a series of random numbers she'd apparently generated that morning, which she was betting the soldier at the entrance would not cross-reference in the next 30 seconds because soldiers at relay station entrances, in her experience, did not enjoy paperwork. She was right. She was inside for 45 seconds before the cross-reference check flagged the order code as invalid and the alarm sounded. 45 seconds. Her partner in those 45 seconds had moved directly to the station's emergency power junction and disabled the primary lighting grid for the station's east wing. Not cut it entirely, that would trigger a secondary alarm. He'd adjusted the power cycling to produce a flicker, a specific oscillating pattern that the Makath soldiers in the east wing would experience as an equipment malfunction rather than an attack. Then, the alarm sounded, and the Makath soldiers in the east wing went to respond to an equipment malfunction in a flickering corridor. And ran into Sergeant Operative Declan Birch, who had come out of the maintenance crawl space. What happened next is on camera and I have reviewed it 11 times and I'm going to do my best to describe it accurately, because what I saw in those 4 minutes and 37 seconds is part of why I moved the feed to primary and part of why, when the council chamber went quiet 3 days later, I was not entirely surprised. 3 humans. 11 Makath soldiers in the East Wing corridor, plus 2 more coming from the emergency response station, plus the soldiers in the West Wing who were now moving to assist. And Declan Birch in the middle of it with what I can only describe as the expression of someone who has thought about this moment for a long time and is now in it and is operating from a place so far below fear that fear is not even a useful reference point anymore. He fought like someone with a very clear to-do list. That is the only way I can describe it. Not frantic. Not desperate. A soldier who has an objective, who is somewhere on the timeline between the start of that objective and the completion of it, and who is treating the 22 soldiers attempting to stop him as a variable in that timeline rather than a reason to reconsider. He broke the East Wing communication relay at 3:14. He disabled the backup beacon transmitter at 3:18. He was back in the maintenance corridor at 3:22, and the only reason the Makath soldiers knew he'd been there was the broken equipment and the fact that 3 of their number were being treated for what the medical report later called non-fatal but deeply inconvenient injuries. The other two humans were gone. They'd left through the same door they'd entered. Security cameras caught them walking away from the station at a pace that, frame by frame, I measured at approximately the pace of people who are working very hard to look like they have somewhere to be and are not in a hurry to get there. The fake order code had been for 40 units of atmospheric coolant. The station commander's incident report noted, at the bottom, in what I read as a tone somewhere between professional restraint and personal bewilderment, that he was unable to determine what the attackers had actually achieved, because all systems appeared functional, all security logs appeared intact, and no personnel had been killed or taken. The navigational beacon, however, was offline. And would remain offline for 6 days. During which time, the Brannick, as promised, and, for other cargo freighters, would make full transit runs to the outer settlements without once encountering a Machath patrol. Because the patrol vessels couldn't navigate the corridor without the beacon. Because the beacon was running Declan Birch's false timing signal. Because Declan Birch had been in a crawl space for 4 hours and had done 11 minutes of work. I sat in my chair for a long time after I finished the analysis. The Vethel liquid had gone cold. I didn't get a new cup. I sat with the report in front of me and I did something I don't usually do in incident analysis. I tried to think about what it felt like to be in that corridor. To be the soldier at the entrance, faced with a polite woman and an order code that probably wouldn't check out, and choosing the path of least paperwork. To be the Machath soldiers in the East Wing, responding to a flicker in the lights, running into something in a corridor that moved like it had a very clear to-do list. To be the station commander, writing a report at the end of a very bad night and arriving at the conclusion that technically nothing had been stolen, technically no one was dead, technically this was an equipment malfunction and an unauthorized entry and maybe a paperwork error. To be Declan Birch. 4 hours in a crawl space. 11 minutes of work. Back in the maintenance corridor. Done. 400,000 people on the outer settlements would receive their medical resupply on schedule. I put that in the report. I annotated it. I recommended immediate escalation to the Council's Security Advisory Committee. Nobody from Security Advisory called me back. But, 3 days later, an alert came in from the Council's Central Monitoring Division. The Machath Sovereignty had called an emergency council session. They were bringing evidence, they said, of organized human military activity in a non-military designated corridor. They were going to demand a formal censure and a council-mandated restriction on human corridor access. I looked at my cold Vethel liquid. I looked at my reports. I looked at the note I'd written in my log about Declan Birch and the 4 hours in the crawl space. I got up. I went to the council chamber. I thought I was going to file another report. The Galactic Council chamber smells like something between ozone and rain. I don't know why. I've asked 3 people who've worked here longer than me and gotten 3 different explanations involving the atmospheric processing system, the mineral content of the cleaning agents, and one theory about residual ions from centuries of heated argument that I suspect was not entirely serious. Whatever the cause, the smell is the first thing when the doors open, and, for me it's become the sensory equivalent of brace yourself. I braced myself. The chamber was full. Not unusual for an emergency session, the delegations had been notified overnight and the gallery was lined with observers, aides, translation matrix operators, and the specific category of being who seems to exist at every political venue across the known galaxy. The ones who are not officially present, are clearly present, and are watching everything with the focused attention of people whose salaries depend on knowing things before they're officially announced. I had a junior analyst's access badge, which means I was in the back third of the gallery, behind a support column that partially blocked my view of the Machath delegations table. I had my data pad. I had my logs. I had my reports, all 7 of them, which nobody from any relevant department had acknowledged. I also had, somewhat inexplicably, a cup of Vethel liquid that I'd grabbed from the corridor dispenser on the way in, which I almost immediately regretted because emergency sessions typically last 4 to 6 hours and there are no refreshment facilities inside the chamber and the Vethel liquid would be cold in 20 minutes. The Machath Sovereignty was represented by Senior Delegate Rovithkai, who I had encountered exactly once before in a corridor and who had the specific quality of presence that makes beings who outrank you feel like they're being generous by acknowledging your existence. Rovoth Kai had come prepared. He had a dossier physical, not digital, which is a power move in a room full of datapads, and, for aides arranged behind him with the particular stillness of aides who have rehearsed for this. The council's presiding chair, Ambassador Orvai, who I will note is a perfectly adequate bureaucrat and, was not, in my opinion, built for the day that was coming, called the session to order with the standard three-chime sequence and, invited the Makath delegation to present their case. Rovoth Kai stood. He spoke for 40 minutes. I will summarize, because 40 minutes of Rovoth Kai is a lot of Rovoth Kai. The Makath sovereignty had documented what they characterized as a systematic campaign of human hostile activity in Corridor 7. He had evidence of the Brannica's Promise incident, which he presented as a deliberate exploitation of the transit accords by human operatives using a staged medical emergency. He had evidence of what he called an attempted negotiation by bad faith actors, the operative Merrill Channel conversation, which had apparently been recorded and analyzed. He had evidence of the relay station incident, which he presented as a paramilitary attack on Makath sovereign infrastructure, documenting 3 injured soldiers, disabled equipment, and the false beacon signal. He placed these incidents in a pattern. He used the word pattern 11 times. He argued that what appeared to be unrelated civilian and commercial activity was in fact a coordinated human strategy of low-level hostile action designed to circumvent the Council's non-intervention protocols by remaining technically below the threshold of formal military action. He was not wrong. That was the difficult part. He was describing something accurate. He was describing it in the worst possible framing, stripping everything but the tactical mechanics, presenting it as aggression rather than response, and doing so with 40 minutes of very organized evidence in a physical dossier in a room full of beings who control 7 relay nodes and have long memories. But he was not wrong. I looked at the delegations around the chamber. I looked at their faces, the ones with legible faces. Anyway, the Varan delegation, for instance, communicates entirely through chromatophore shifts, and I've never been able to read them, which they are probably aware of and probably find convenient. What I could read, I read as uncomfortable. Not outraged. Not sympathetic. Uncomfortable in the specific way of beings watching an argument they don't want to have go somewhere they don't want it to go. Rovoth Kai concluded his presentation with a formal demand that the Council issue a binding resolution restricting human access to Corridor 7, mandating a review of human activity in all contested corridors, and placing the human settlements under a formal observation protocol that would require disclosure of all commercial and civilian activities to a Council-monitored transparency board. He sat down. There was a silence that was not the silence. It was the ordinary silence of an assembly registering the weight of a proposal. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then, Ambassador Orbai said that the Council would hear a response, and asked whether the human representative wished to present. There was another silence. I checked the chamber. The human delegations table, smaller than the Makath table, 2 chairs rather than 5, in the mid-tier seating that reflects their current Council status, had a man in one of the chairs. He was not, I noted, in any kind of formal diplomatic attire. He was wearing clothes that I would describe as functional. Dark. Practical. The kind of clothes that are not a statement because they're not trying to be. He had the build of someone who'd spent a lot of time doing physical things and had not spent a lot of time since then, trying to look like he hadn't. I did not recognize him from the human diplomatic registry. He stood. He said, "We'll respond." His name, I later found out, was Declan Birch. The same Declan Birch. 4 hours in the crawlspace Declan Birch. 11 minutes of work Declan Birch. I spilled my Vethel liquid on my datapad. He did not have a dossier. He had a datapad, which he set on the table and did not consult. He spoke for 11 minutes. I have the transcript. I've read it so many times that I can recite large sections from memory, which is not something I intended to develop, but here we are. I'll give you the structure, because the structure is the thing. He started by acknowledging everything Rovoth Kai had said. Not disputing it. Not reframing it. He said, yes, the Brannica's Promise crew staged a medical emergency to secure transit. Yes, Operative Merrill negotiated using information gained during the blockade. Yes, the relay station was accessed without authorization and equipment was temporarily disabled. He said he could explain why. Then, he did something that I have been unable to stop thinking about. He showed the resupply schedules. Not as argument. As context. He put the schedules on the chamber's central display, the dates of the blockade against the pharmaceutical rotation timelines for the outer settlements. He showed the projected shortfall. He showed, in a single line of data, that by day 12 of the Makath blockade, the outer settlement's pediatric ward would have begun rationing medication for a population of children under age 7. He didn't say, "This is why we did it." He didn't say, "This justifies our actions." He showed the schedule, and, then, he moved on to the next point. He talked about the corridor transit accords. He talked about the navigational safety review. He said, and this is the sentence I underlined 3 times, we knew the blockade was extra-legal. We knew the Council's standard review timeline was 6 to 8 weeks. We had 12 days. He said, so we improvised. He said improvised the way you'd say a completely neutral word. Not proud of it. Not apologetic about it. A fact. Then, he addressed the relay station. He said, 3 of my people went into that station. Nobody got killed. The beacon ran a false signal for 6 days. We ran 6 supply transits. The beacon is back online. The Makath soldiers are recovered. He paused. That was the least we could do. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a beat, the ordinary kind, the registering wait kind. Then, 3 things happened at approximately the same time. Rovath Kai stood to respond. I would describe his effect as controlled fury, which is the most dangerous register because it's doing its best to stay inside the format of a formal council session while containing something that would genuinely like to be much louder. He said, the delegate seems to be under the impression that providing context for illegal paramilitary activity is equivalent to justifying it. Birch said, still seated, I didn't say it was justified. I said it was what we had. Rovath Kai said, you deliberately disrupted a sovereign patrol. Birch said, your sovereign patrol was blocking medicine to children. That was the moment the chamber stopped. Not the ordinary silence. Not the 40-second registering wait silence. The silence. 17 translation matrices, offline. I noticed the sound they make when they cut, a faint harmonic hum that I'd been filtering out so long I'd forgotten it was there, and then, it was gone, and the chamber was in the specific acoustic space of a room that has stopped translating, which is a thing that happens when something is said in a way that carries across species without translation. Orvai's water vessel hit the floor. He didn't notice. Rovath Kai was still standing. His mouth had closed. His dossier was on the table in front of him and he was looking at Birch with an expression that I, through my secondary lenses from the back third of the gallery, could read as, I want to be careful here, I don't want to overstate, not anger anymore. Something adjacent to recognition. The particular look of a being who has made an argument that was correct, and has just understood that correct is not the only category that matters. Birch had not raised his voice. He had not moved from his chair. He was looking at Rovath Kai with the same flat attention he'd presumably looked at the East Wing corridor with, at the soldiers coming toward him, at the relay transmitter in the dark. I have a to-do list. You are a variable in it. The translation matrices came back online. The chamber hum returned. Ambient sound flooded back in like something released. Orvai looked at his water vessel on the floor. He looked at it for a long time. I genuinely believe he did not know what to do with it. An aide picked it up. Orvai said, very carefully, the council will take a brief recess. I went out to the corridor during the recess. I didn't go to get another Vethel liquid, my datapad was still wet from the first one. I went because I needed to not be in that room for a few minutes. Because that silence was still in my chest somewhere, sitting between my ribs like a stone, and I needed to process it in a way that didn't involve sitting in a gallery seat behind a column. I found a bench in the observation corridor outside. It looks over the lower assembly ring, all those delegation offices, all those scheduled and unscheduled meetings happening simultaneously, all that grinding slow machinery of cross-species governance. I sat there. I watched it. I thought about Rovothkai's dossier and Birch's resupply schedules and the 12 days and the pediatric ward. A voice said, "You're the analyst who filed the 7 reports." I turned. Birch was standing approximately 2 meters away. He was holding a cup of something that smelled nothing like Vethel liquid and everything like something a human would voluntarily consume, which is an interesting data point. I said, "How did you know about the reports?" He said, "Merrill knows someone in your intake division." Of course she did. I said, "Nobody responded to them." He said, "I know." He didn't sound bothered by it. He sat down on the bench at the other end, facing the same direction I was, watching the same assembly ring. 7 reports recommending reclassification. That's a lot of work for something that got ignored. I said, "What's the reclassification supposed to accomplish?" He was quiet for a moment. He drank his drink. Then, he said, "Makes it harder for them to treat us like we're not paying attention." I looked at him. He was looking at the assembly ring. I said, "You're going to lose the council vote." He said, "Probably." I said, "The observation protocol they're proposing is designed to make everything we do visible and everything they do invisible." He said it without particular heat. "Yeah. We know." I said, "Then, why? Because in 40 years, someone's going to read those 7 reports." He glanced at me. "Maybe someone already is." He stood up. He finished his drink. He looked, briefly, at the assembly ring below, and his face did something I couldn't quite read, not the to-do list flatness, something else, something that was either tiredness or the particular expression of a person carrying a weight they've gotten so used to they've stopped noticing the carrying. He went back into the chamber. I sat on the bench for another 3 minutes. Then, I went back in too. The second half of the session was worse than the first. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. It was worse in the way that slow grinding processes are worse than sudden ones, the way a proposal gets modified through 5 rounds of amendments until it no longer resembles its original form but contains the same essential damage in different packaging. The observation protocol lost its mandatory disclosure clause in the 3rd round of amendments. It retained the transparency board. It retained the review mandate for contested corridor activities. It gained, in the 4th round, a provision that specifically excluded Makath patrol activity from the scope of the transparency review, which was added by the Makath delegation and approved by 11 of the council's 19 voting members. I wrote it all down. I wrote it in my log in the compact shorthand I use for things that make me angry, which is a tight close script that my desk supervisor has told me is unreadable, which is intentional. The vote came in at 14-5. The resolution passed. The human settlements would be under the observation protocol for 1 standard year, after which a review would determine whether to extend, modify, or rescind. The human delegation abstained rather than voting against, which is a procedural move that means we are not accepting this outcome as legitimate, but we are not going to provide the appearance of legitimate opposition for you to point to. I recognized it because I'd seen the Hurani delegation use it 4 years ago in a similar situation and it had annoyed everyone involved for exactly the same reasons, which is what it's designed to do. Orvi declared the session closed. I watched the delegations file out. I watched Rovothkai's aides collect the physical dossier, all those careful pages of evidence, all that organized documentation of what the humans had done in Corridor 7, and stack it into a carry case. I watched the Makath delegation move toward the corridor doors with the particular quality of motion of a group that has won and knows it and is choosing not to perform the winning. I watched Birch leave. He didn't look at Rovothkai. He didn't look at Orvi. He looked at the exit door and he walked to it and he left, with the same quality of motion he'd had in the corridor that morning, somewhere between the start of the to-do list and the end of it. I sat in the gallery for a while after everyone left. The chamber was empty. The hum of the translation matrices had settled back to background frequency. The lights had shifted to the post-session dimmer mode. The water vessel that Orvi had knocked over was gone, cleaned up by some maintenance system, leaving no evidence it had ever happened. I looked at my datapad. The Vethel liquid stain had spread across the lower right corner of the screen. The screen still worked, but the corner was discolored, and every time I looked at it I was going to think about the silence. I filed my 8th report. I noted the vote. I noted the protocol. I noted the abstention. I noted, in a line that I want to acknowledge is not strictly within the professional scope of incident analysis, that the Makath delegation's framing had been accurate and incomplete simultaneously, and that the Council's resolution had addressed the accurate part while not engaging with the incomplete part, and that the part it had not engaged with was the part that would determine whether any of this mattered in 5 years. I marked the report, see Appendix C for full relay station incident analysis. See Appendix D for resupply timeline data. See Appendix E for operative Merrill negotiation transcript. I sent it. I went home. I did not sleep well. I need to tell you about the following morning, because the following morning is what made me start writing this account instead of just filing reports. I got in early. I got my first Vethel liquid. I sat down at my desk. I pulled up the overnight flags. There were no flags from Corridor 7. There was a flag from the Outer Settlements Communications Relay. Not urgent. Not incident coded. Just a status update, supply run completed, all pharmaceutical stock transferred, pediatric ward at full inventory. I read it twice. Then, I open my incident log, all 8 reports, the appendices, the transcripts, the beacon analysis, the debris field mapping data, the medical emergency footage, the relay station camera footage of Declan Birch in the East Wing corridor with his to-do list phase, and I read through it from the beginning. All of it. It took most of the morning. When I was done, I opened a new document. Not a report. Not a flag. A document, which in the Council archive system is classified as a long-form analytical account and is generally filed by senior archivists, not junior analysts. I am, as noted, a junior analyst. I filed it anyway. I titled it, Corridor 7 Incident Series, Human Decision-Making Under Constrained Conditions, with reference to strategic improvisation and pack coordination. That is the document you are currently reading. There is one more thing from that morning. A message. Direct transmission, non-official channel, not encrypted but also not flagged for Council monitoring because it came through one of the secondary civilian relay systems that the monitoring protocol apparently hadn't been updated to include yet. It was from Operative Merrill. It said, heard about the vote. Hank, next time you file a report that nobody reads, you might want to CC the Hurani delegation's cultural attaché. She's been doing a comparative study on small species corridor politics for 8 years and she does not like the Makath sovereignty even a little bit. Just a thought. Also, Becker says hi. He doesn't know who you are, I just told him to say it. I read it 3 times. Then, I wrote Operative Merrill's contact information into my file. And I CC'd the Hurani cultural attaché on the document you're reading now. The observation protocol went into effect on a Tuesday. I know the Council doesn't use Terran-time designations, but Birch used that word in a message I received 3 days after the vote, a brief note through the same civilian relay that Merrill had used, which I was beginning to understand was not coincidental, and it stuck. Tuesday. There's something very human about naming the days of the week. Very deliberate. Here is this unit of time. I have given it a name. It is mine now. The protocol went into effect on a Tuesday, and, by that Friday, another Terran designation, I was collecting them now like minor vices I had received, through official Council channels, exactly 1 activity disclosure from the human settlements under the new transparency mandate. 1. I had been expecting approximately 40. I flagged the discrepancy to compliance. Compliance sent me a form letter explaining that disclosure requirements under the new protocol apply to activities meeting a threshold of political or strategic significance, which was defined in Section 14 of the resolution as activities reasonably likely to affect the territorial or navigational interests of sovereignty-recognized corridor stakeholders. I read Section 14 4 times. I consulted the definition of a sovereignty-recognized corridor stakeholders. I determined that this phrase, as written, technically required disclosure of activities that might affect the Makath sovereignty specifically, since they were the only entity with formal sovereignty recognition in Corridor 7. The humans had read Section 14. Of course they had. The one disclosure I received was a notification that a civilian vessel, the Galactic's Promise, specifically, with what I took as either coincidence or a very dry joke, would be conducting a navigational survey of Corridor 7 for commercial mapping purposes, which was not required to be disclosed under Section 14 but which they were disclosing as a courtesy. I wrote a note in my log: the observation protocol is going to generate an enormous amount of paperwork that contains nothing useful. Then, I thought about it. Then, I wrote, that is the point. The Hurani cultural attaché contacted me on the Wednesday, which I now knew meant it was the day after the Tuesday, following the protocol's implementation. Her name was Research Principal Avesoli, and she had been studying what she called asymmetric political navigation by small population species for, as Merrill had noted, 8 years. She had 23 papers in the Council's academic archive, none of which I had read, all of which I immediately added to my reading queue. She contacted me about the document. She had questions. They were good questions. The one I keep returning to, the one she asked in her third message, after we'd established that I was not, in fact, a senior archivist but was apparently a junior analyst who had filed a long-form document in the senior archivist section through some administrative loophole she found more admirable than alarming, was this: when does your analysis indicate the humans understood what they were doing? I mean structurally. Not tactically. Did they know, at the beginning of the corridor incident, that they were building a pattern? I sat with that for a long time. The answer, I thought, was probably not. The Galactic's Promise was a cargo freighter running a supply route. When the Makath patrol came after them, the crew improvised. The medical emergency wasn't a strategy. It was a person in a bad situation finding a door that was technically open and walking through it. The fact that the door was Article 14 of the Transit Accords probably reflects, as Merrill later told me when I asked, that the Galactic's Promise's captain had spent 6 months studying the Accords before she ever ran the corridor, because she'd been running contested corridors for 12 years and studying the agreements was how you found the doors before you needed them. Merrill's negotiations weren't a strategy either. Not originally. She'd had 4 days of silence during the blockade, and she'd spent them the way she apparently spent all waiting time, learning things. The debris field mapping was not part of a plan. It was what she did when there was nothing else to do and there was something to figure out. The silicate trade offer emerged from the mapping. The leverage point emerged from knowing the Makath supply chain, which she knew because she'd read their trade disclosures, which they filed publicly with the Council because they're a sovereignty-recognized corridor stakeholder and the disclosures are legally required. She'd read their paperwork. She'd found the door. And, Birch, I asked him about the relay station, eventually. In a second meeting I requested through channels I'm not going to document because compliance would have questions. I asked him whether the 4 hours in the crawl space were planned. He said, the crawl space was planned. The 4 hours wasn't. I said, what do you mean? He said, I plan to go in through the maintenance access. I didn't plan on it taking 4 hours. Things were positioned differently than the schematics showed. A pause. So I waited. I said, for 4 hours. He said, until the positioning was right. I said, and if it hadn't become right? He looked at me. His face did the thing again, the thing I'd seen in the chamber, the not quite tiredness, the weight that was so habitual it had stopped being visible. He said, it was going to become right. Or we were going to find another way. I said, that's not a plan. He said, no. It's confidence. I wrote that in my log. I underlined it. I started a new appendix. 3 weeks after the protocol went into effect, I received a transmission flag I had not been expecting. It was from the Makath Sovereignty's secondary diplomatic channel, the same one that Merrill had used for the silicate negotiation. The message was not addressed to me specifically. It was addressed to the Council's Corridor Affairs Division, which is a 3-person office that I technically assist but do not officially work for. The message was from a Makath Trade Administration official, not Rovathkai, not a political delegate, an administrative official in the supply chain division, and it was asking about the documentation requirements for importing refined silicate from non-aligned species. The documentation requirements. Not a political communication. Not a territorial claim. A bureaucratic inquiry about paperwork. I flagged it to the Corridor Affairs Division. I got an automated acknowledgement. Then, 3 hours later, I got a non-automated message from the senior Corridor Affairs officer, who I had previously interacted with approximately twice and who had the specific energy of someone who has been doing this job for 30 years and has become a connoisseur of things that don't make sense yet but will. She wrote, "Do you know what this is about?" I wrote back, "I have a theory." She wrote, "Come tell me your theory." I went to Corridor Affairs. I told her about Merrill. I told her about the debris field mapping. I told her about the silicate offer that had ended the blockade. I showed her the negotiation transcript from Appendix C. She read it. She read it carefully, the way someone reads something when they're looking for the thing underneath the thing. She said, "Merrill still has the charts?" I said, "I don't know. I assume so." She said, "The Makath are down 2 silicate suppliers this quarter. There's been a breakdown with one of the outer arm trading entities unrelated to the corridor situation. They're running low." I sat with that. She said, "That inquiry isn't political. Somebody in their trade administration found out Merrill had debris field silicate and found out she'd offered to trade it during the blockade and is trying to quietly open a commercial channel before the political people find out and make it complicated." I said, "Can they do that?" She said, "They can try." She paused. She looked at the transcript again. She said, "You know what's interesting? Rovathkai's entire case before the council was about the humans using the Accords as a tool. Using the legal framework against them. And here's the Makath Trade Division using the exact same framework, the commercial access provisions of the Transit Accords, to open a channel with the people they just spent 6 weeks trying to strangle." She leaned back. "That girl," she said, and she meant Merrill, offered them something they needed, and they said no because they were in the middle of a political operation, and now the political operation is over and they're quietly coming back around." She looked at me. "How old is she?" I checked my file. 31. The Corridor Affairs officer was silent for a moment. Then, she said something I did not expect. "The Makath sovereignty has been operating in this sector for 60 years. They've established every advantage you can establish in 60 years, the beacon network, the patrol routes, the transit fee structure, the leverage over the relay nodes. 60 years of infrastructure." She tapped the transcript. "And a 31-year-old woman with 4 days and a debris field has more commercial leverage than they do right now." She sent the trade documentation inquiry to the standard processing queue. She did not flag it for political review. I walked back to my desk and sat down and thought about the word infrastructure. I thought about what it means to build infrastructure versus what it means to use infrastructure. I thought about the 60 years and the 4 days. I thought about Birch's word confidence and what it means to be confident when you have no infrastructure, when you have a supply route and 400,000 people and 12 days. What it means to look at an 11,000-year debris field and say, "Fine, I'll learn to navigate it." I opened a new appendix. I titled it, "Note on Structural Confidence in Constrained Environments." I wrote for 2 hours. I sent it to Ave Soli. She responded in 20 minutes. "This is the thing I've been trying to articulate for 8 years. You wrote it in 2 hours. I'm going to need you to co-author the paper." I wrote back that I was a junior analyst who had filed a long-form document in the wrong archive section and was probably going to have a compliance conversation about it at some point. She wrote back, "Perfect. That's the kind of person who should be writing this paper." 6 weeks after the protocol's implementation, Declan Birch was called before the Council's Security Advisory Committee. Not the full Council. The committee, which is smaller, less formal, and, I say this having now attended 3 of its sessions, operates on the theory that removing the audiences and the translation matrices and the procedural formalities will produce more honest conversations. Whether this works depends significantly on who's in the room and what they're willing to say. I was not invited. I found out about it from Ave Soli, who was not invited but has a working relationship with the Hurani delegation's security liaison, who was. What I know is what the security liaison told Ave Soli, who told me. The committee had asked Birch about the relay station. They'd asked about his operational training, his chain of command, whether the Faro Corridor Defense Initiative had a formal strategic planning structure and, if so, what was its relationship to the Outer Settlements civilian administration. He'd answered, minimal training, loose command, the FCDI had no formal strategic planning and its relationship to civilian administration was that they were the same people, more or less. The committee had asked what he meant by more or less. He'd said, the station doctors know how to fly. The supply coordinators know how to navigate. The people who run the hydroponic systems know how to operate communications equipment. The committee had asked whether this was by design. He'd said, partly. Partly it's what happens when you're 400,000 people 4 light-years from the nearest council-recognized military support structure. You learn the things you might need. A committee member had asked, and, what do you think you might need? According to the security liaison, who told Ave Soli, who told me Birch had been quiet for a moment. Then, he said, whatever we haven't thought of yet. The security liaison apparently found this deeply unsettling. Ave Soli apparently found it the most clarifying sentence she'd heard in 8 years of research. I found it somewhere between those 2 responses, which is where I seem to spend a lot of my professional life now. Whatever we haven't thought of yet. Not a list. Not a threat assessment. Not a capability inventory. A posture. A commitment to being ready for the category of unknown unknowns rather than the known ones. I thought about the crawl space. About mapping an 11,000-year debris field in 4 days. About Article 14 and the order code and the flickering lights and Merrill on a Makath internal channel, calmly discussing whether the green supplements were the problem. A species that prepares for the things it hasn't thought of yet does it by making sure that every member of it has, at minimum, the framework to figure something out. Not the specific knowledge. The framework. The confidence, Birch's word again, always Birch's word, that when the unthought thing happens, someone in reach will be able to find a door. I thought about Rovithkai's dossier. 40 minutes of careful documentation. Everything the humans had done, organized and labeled and indexed. The pattern. The pattern he'd described as hostile activity. The pattern I was beginning to think of as something else. The commercial channel between the Makath Trade Division and Operative Merrill was formalized quietly, 6 weeks after the inquiry. It did not go through political channels. It went through the standard commercial registry, which processes roughly 800 filings a standard day and which does not, as far as I know, have anyone specifically assigned to notice when a filing represents a minor geopolitical realignment. Merrill sent me a message when it was processed. She said, first silicate shipment departs in 3 weeks. Becker is insufferably smug about it. I told him he didn't actually do anything. He reminded me he's the one who figured out the retrieval equipment would work on the debris field margins. I told him that's barely doing something. He said it was definitely more than nothing. We argued about it for 20 minutes. Anyway, the corridor is fine. The kids have their medication. How's the paper going? I wrote back that the paper was going, and that I'd found an inconsistency in the relay station timeline that I thought was important, and that I was going to need her input on the section about the debris field mapping methodology. She wrote back that she'd help, and asked whether I'd updated my Vethel liquid situation, because she'd heard through someone who'd heard through someone that I had spilled it on my datapad during the council session and that this was, in her assessment, a bad sign about coping mechanisms in high-stakes situations. I wrote back that the Vethel liquid was the coping mechanism. She wrote back, okay, but is it working? I looked at my desk. The new datapad replacement for the stained one was open to the draft of the paper. The incident log was filed. The 8 reports were filed. The appendices were filed. The commercial channel was processing. The corridor was open. The kids had their medication. Was it working? I wrote back, I'll let you know. I want to end this account with something that happened 2 months after the council session, because I've been trying to decide whether to include it and I've decided I should, even though it doesn't fit neatly into the analytical framework. I was at my desk. Standard shift. Corridor 7 was quiet. The Makath had reduced their patrol presence after the commercial channel opened, which the corridor affairs officer had noted Drilly was the most efficiently resolved territorial dispute she'd seen in a decade, not that she was acknowledging the method. I had 3 low-priority flags, none from Corridor 7, 2 easily resolved, one that was going to become compliance's problem in about a week. I had a cup of Vethel liquid that was actually still warm, which I consider a minor victory. I got a message from Ave Soli. She'd finished her draft of the paper's 3rd section, the section on structural confidence, and she'd sent it for my review. I opened it. She'd titled the section, The Prepared Mind, How Human Settlement Culture Converts Individual Improvisation into Collective Resilience. I read the first 3 paragraphs. She'd used Birch's crawlspace incident as the opening example. She described it well, the 4 hours, the waiting, the 11 minutes of work, and then she'd made a connection I hadn't made in any of my 8 reports, hadn't made in the appendices, hadn't articulated even in my private log. She'd written, what Sergeant Operative Birch demonstrated in the relay station was not primarily tactical patience, though tactical patience was the mechanism. What he demonstrated was the product of a community that has internalized a specific belief that the situation, whatever it is, will become navigable if approached with enough time and enough flexibility. This belief is not optimism. It is not irrational confidence. It is the transmitted cultural memory of a species that has, repeatedly, navigated situations for which no prior framework existed. What Birch had in that crawl space was not a plan. He had something older than a plan, the knowledge, bone deep, that the people counting on him would do the same for him, and that together this amounted to something no dossier could inventory. I read it 3 times. I thought about what I'd seen in the council chamber. Rovithkai's 40 minutes of evidence and Birch's 11. I thought about the translation matrices cutting out. I thought about the silence. The silence had happened at the word children. At your sovereign patrol was blocking medicine to children. And I'd been sitting with it for 2 months trying to understand what exactly had crossed the translation gap in that moment, what had reached through 17 languages and the formalities of a council session and the specific cold machinery of interspecies politics and landed in that room like something human-shaped and undeniable. Ave Soli had given me the answer. The knowledge, bone deep, that the people counting on him would do the same for him. Not a strategy. Not a justification. A fact about what it means to be part of something. What it means to be 400,000 people 4 light-years from formal support, to know that the person in the crawl space is there because someone else filled a cargo manifest and someone else mapped a debris field and someone else sat on a channel for 2 hours talking about supplements, and all of it connects, and all of it points at the same thing: we are going to make sure the kids have their medication. That's what the chamber had heard. That's what the translation matrices hadn't needed to translate. I wrote Ave Soli, the 3rd section is right. Don't change it. I looked at my warm Vethel liquid. I looked at the quiet corridor 7 flags. The commercial channel. The pediatric ward at full inventory. The debris field, now charted, 6 navigable paths through 11,000 years of hazard. I thought about Merrill's message. How's the paper going? I thought about what Birch had said in the committee. Whatever we haven't thought of yet. I drank my Vethel liquid while it was still warm. And I filed the 9th report. Sarah Vetdone, Incident Analyst, Corridor Affairs Division Longform Analytical Account, Council Archive Reference, CA7DH0094 Status, Open Supplemental Reports, Ongoing.